We'll go ahead and be turning to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. We'll be resuming our study that we began on Wednesday evening in Romans chapter 1. Before we get to where we are in Romans chapter 1, we want to quickly remind ourselves of our outline and how this chapter fits in the bigger picture of the book of Romans. And then we'll quickly remind ourselves of some of the things we already saw. Some of the things we already saw here in chapter 1 on Wednesday, leading up to verse 18, which is really it's the section that's making the point that the chapter's theme really is, which is that the Gentiles need the gospel. The book, as we outlined it last week, divides down into two major sections. Now, we further subdivided that down, and we'll remind ourselves of that here in a moment. But it has two major sections, two larger sections that we're using sort of to encompass the general thought in these sections. And then we narrow it down a little bit more. Narrow it down a little bit more in our subsections, trying to remind us exactly what's taking place here in the book. Our first section, really as we referred to it last week, the argumentative section, if you will, Paul dealing with, here's the issue I'm trying to address, and so here's the answer to that. The big issue he's dealing with is some of them are trying to keep the works of the old law and thinking you're justified by the works of the old law. And the point that Paul is making is justification is by faith through grace. And so the first 11 chapters are focused on that thought about how man is justified by faith through grace. We've subdivided that down into three other subsections. 1 through 3, which, as we pointed out, chapter 1 is about the Gentile sin. Chapter 2 is about the Jew sin. Chapter 3, if the Gentile sin and the Jew sin, all sin. So 1 through 3 is the need for justification. So again, Gentile sin. So chapter 1, Gentiles need the gospel, Jews need the gospel. Chapter 2, 3, then all need the gospel. All have need of this justification because Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Well, all need it. Chapter 4, it's available to all. Through chapter 8, justification is available to all. Starting in chapter 4, going through chapter 8, that's what Paul's pointing out. That opportunity to be saved is available to each and every one. Then 9 through 11 is the rejection of justification. That is the Jews' rejection of God's plan. Or as we saw in chapter 10 and in verse 3, as we were looking ahead at our phrase, the righteousness of God, they have rejected and not submitted to the righteousness of God, according to chapter 10 and in verse 3. So they had not submitted to God's plan and had rejected the justification even though it was available to them. Chapter 9 through chapter 11. Chapter 12 beginning then is the application section. Paul's writings tend to have a more argumentative section, and that is, here's the issue that I'm needing to address. Whether that's defending his apostleship in some of his epistles, whether that's arguing about justification by faith through grace, whatever that is, Paul has sort of a more argumentative section in terms of, here's addressing whatever the problem is. And then he has, in almost every one of his books, a section that I would simply refer to as the application section. We can outline it in various ways, or call it various things, but simply 12 through 16 is just that application section of the book of Romans, or living as a Christian. You understand now, 1 through 11, you're justified by faith through grace. 12 through 16, here's how you act in light of that. In light of the fact that you have been justified, here's how you act, chapter 12, in your relationships to one another. Chapter 13, in relationship to the government. Chapter 14 and 15, between the strong and weak in conscience. And chapter 16 is just sort of his customary closing remarks, greet so-and-so. And then a few closing exhortations there in chapter 6, or chapter 16. So that last section is really here's how we apply now. Now that we know we've been justified, here's how we live in light of that. Now, chapter 1, reminding ourselves of what we've seen so far in chapter 1, and then we'll get into verse 18 here in just a moment. Chapter 1, Gentiles need the gospel. The reason is, as we'll see here in 18 through the end of the chapter in a moment, Gentiles need it because Gentiles have sinned and face the wrath of God. Which, as we pointed out on Wednesday, was the answer to question, part of the answer to question 1. As we briefly summarize the chapter, we said the chapter introduces the epistle, discusses its eagerness to preach in Rome, and that the Gentiles have sinned and face the wrath of God. 1 through 7 was an introduction section. We said we didn't have it subdivided down in our material, but we said there's really 3 introductions, if you will. Verse 1 and verse 7 is Paul's customary introduction. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle. Verse 7, to those who are in Rome. The end of verse 1 into verse 2 is really an introduction to the gospel, if you will. He's pointing out that he's called to be an apostle set apart for the gospel of God. Now, it's important later on because, according to him, in verse 16, he's not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God's salvation. So he's an apostle to that gospel, the gospel of God. Which he promised beforehand through the prophets. So you go back to the Old Testament. That was promised of that message in the Old Testament, in the Holy Scriptures, verse 3, concerning his Son. 3 through 6 is an introduction to Christ. Now, obviously these are Christians here, so they know about the gospel of Christ, but in terms of his epistle, here's some introductory points he wants to make concerning the gospel of Christ in the remarks that he's going to endeavor in. So he points out that the Scriptures foretold of Christ who descended from David according to the flesh. We pointed out on Wednesday, it doesn't matter how you trace the lineage of Christ, whether you trace his lineage through his mother, as it should be traced, or the supposed lineage through Joseph. However you trace it, in the end, David's in both of those lineages. So, as you trace the genealogies, you'll see David in both of those. Verse 4, not only do the Scriptures foretell him, verse 3, verse 4, he was declared to be the Son of God in power by the resurrection from the dead. And it's through him that we receive grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. So we're going to argue through the next several chapters that justification is by what? Justification is by faith, right? Faith through grace. So we're going to argue that, but Paul begins before he ever argues about the justification by faith to point out that there's an obedience to faith. There's an importance of obedience, and not just simply saying that I believe, but there is an obedience that has to be carried out. Paul introduces that idea here, as we pointed out last Sunday as well as on Wednesday in chapter 1, verse 5, the obedience of faith. Again, at the end of the book, 16, I think it's 26, something like that, that he brings it back up again at the end of the book, a sort of bookending. I talk about justification by faith through grace, but don't forget that faith is active and obedient. He points out that this is included to all who are called to belong to Christ in verse 6, and then again verse 7, he ends his customary greeting. We pointed out how was Christ, Jesus declared to be the Son of God was by the resurrection from the dead. 8 through 15 then was Paul's eagerness to preach in Rome. So he was thankful for the Roman brethren in 8 and 9. First of all, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of the Son. And without ceasing, I mention you. He points out in verse 9, verse 10 rather, as mentioning is in prayers. 10 through 12, he talks about his desire to come and see them, that he may impart to them some spiritual gift, that he may strengthen them, that he can be encouraged by them as well. And then he gives some other reasons for his visit, 13 through 15. He wants to reap some harvest or bear fruit among them, because he's a debtor or under obligation, and because he's eager or he's sort of ready to be there and to preach in Rome. And that was what we dealt with in question 3. 16 and 17, where we finished up on Wednesday, was the purpose of rhyming. 16, he's not ashamed of the gospel. 17, the righteousness of God is revealed. Verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God's salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. What's it? Verse 17. In what is the righteousness of God revealed?
Gospel.
The gospel. And so we talked about that righteousness of God. What is it? We said it's God's plan to make man righteous. And as Paul uses it here in Romans, Chapter 3, 21 and 22, that righteousness is revealed apart from the law. Well, the gospel is apart from the law, right? The point is that they don't need to go back to the old law. They need to be, they're justified by the gospel. 3, 21 and 22, it says the righteousness of God is revealed, and is revealed apart from the law. And pointed out in chapter 10 that the problem with the Jews was they were ignorant of the righteousness of God and had not submitted to it. That tells me that one can be ignorant of it and one can come to know the righteousness of God, and that one must submit to the righteousness of God. As we point out, that's God's plan for making us righteous. Here's how we need to live. That's revealed to us in the gospel. And so he points out in verse 17, then the righteous shall live by faith. Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, as we pointed out on very briefly Wednesday, but as well on Sunday, that's where that passage is originally found. It's a quotation of Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. Galatians 3 and verse 11 would also quote it to be a direct quote. Hebrews 10:38 would be another portion of that quote in Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 38. So we pointed out on Wednesdays we're concluding what is the righteousness of God? Well, it's God's plan to make man righteous. And there's three key important factors we already pointed out, revealed to us in Romans. It's revealed apart from the law, something we can be ignorant of, and something we must submit to. And then what Old Testament passage we quoted in verse 17, that's Habakkuk chapter 2 and in verse 4. Now we're ready for verse 18. Verse 18 beginning is really getting into the larger section of these first three chapters. You could, if you wanted to think of it this way, 1 through 17 has still somewhat to a point kind of been an introduction, if you will. If you wanted to think of it that way, that 1 through 17 or 1 through 15 was more of an introduction. So he points out, in a section, that I want to greet you, and I wish I could come to you, and I mention you in prayer, and I hope someday to come to you. And then really he starts to shift about verse 16. Verse 15 he pointed out that he was eager to preach in Rome, or to come to preach to those that are in Rome also, verse 15, to come and to preach the gospel to them, because, verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. You've heard me say before, if you see the words for and therefore, what do you need to do?
Look above.
Look above. Go back to whatever was previous in that chapter. So, verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. That's why I'm eager. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God's salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Why is it the power of God's salvation to everyone that believes? Verse 17, for in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, why is that important? Verse 18, for. Again, there's our word, for. What do we need to do? Go back. That's why we've been establishing these principles through 17 verses. So 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Reason is, it's the righteous, in it the righteousness of God is revealed. That's important because the righteous shall live by faith. For, verse 18 beginning now, that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness of men. Now we're going to further subdivide that down. That's 18 through the end of the text. The first section we'll look at is the God's wrath is revealed against all unrighteousness because they have not glorified God. Look at verse 18 beginning. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. We'll come back to that here in just a moment. Verse 21 now. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So backing up now to verse 18. He's pointing out in verse 18, the reason that it's important that he be preaching the gospel is that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. You think about the number of times that Paul has pointed out about Paul, that an epistle points out, or times it point out, here's a sin, and those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And the way they refer to them, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 9, do not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then he comes in here in a passage in Romans, and he says, you know what these people are who faces God's wrath? It's the unrighteous. So let's back up for just a second. God's righteousness is revealed. What do we say God's righteousness is? His plan what? To make man righteous. If one does that and lives by faith, he then is, verse 17, who lives by faith?
The righteous.
The righteous lives by faith. These people that face the wrath of God, they're the opposite of that. These are those who have gone against the principles of God. So they're the ones, remember chapter 10 verse 3, the problem with the Jews was they had not submitted to God's righteousness. Verse 18, those who face the wrath of God, and those who do not obey and do not submit to the righteousness of God. That's those who are facing the wrath of God in verse 18. Not only them, the ungodly, those who do not see to reverence or respect God.
Micah, I like how my concordance says on verse 18, the wrath is not the revelation of a future judgment of God, but a present revelation that parallels the present revelation of God's righteousness. The revelation comes from heaven. Ungodliness is failure in the religious realm. Unrighteousness is failure in the moral sphere, or injustice toward men who hold and supplies the truth in righteousness. So both are at the same time. That wrath and the righteous, you get one by not doing the other. And if they can't say that this is a future wrath. No, it's a present judgment now. And, well, it was then too, but now, if we are unrighteous, we get the wrath of God.
Yeah, I think though the bigger part of what under his consideration is the future wrath that is revealed, going to be revealed. And the reason I think that in part, aside from that, there are some consequences now. We all know there's consequences now. But to see it is, and I had this note on here, is compared to verse 5 of chapter 2, and he talks about that will be revealed. And so I think there's a sense in which they face some judgment now. There's some consequences to sin. But I think verse 18 ultimately has its point too. There's the ultimate revealing of the wrath of God, and that is the eternal consequence of that, which is that eternal separation from God. Yes?
I think about Hebrews 11, verse 3. This just comes into my mind with this about creation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. And when I think about the creation, it declares God. I think this kind of sheds some light, at least in my mind it does.
Yes, you're right. We'll discuss it here more in just a second. Real quick, verse 18, wrapping it up to get us to that next section. So those that have done those that are unrighteous, those who have violated the will of God, they face the wrath of God. 4, verse 19, what can be known about God is plain to them. So again, what are our key words we're looking for here in the text that tells us to go back? 4, you see a string of verses. 4, the wrath of God. 4, what can be known about God is plain to them. Because God is shown to them. What do you mean it's plain to them? Verse 20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived or seen, ever since the creation of the world. Well, how so? Mike just pointed out, verse 20, it goes on to point out as well. How is it clearly perceived or clearly seen? By what? Creation. Take this more separate table right here. I couldn't make something like that, but I tell you what, that's some pretty good work right there. You know what that tells me?
Somebody made it.
Somebody made it. That a tree didn't fall down and shatter into the perfect shape of this right here with the carving on the front for a Lord's Supper table. Right? These pews right here, we know somebody had to make them. Right? When we see something, somebody created it. And the point that Paul is making here is they're without excuse because the evidence them. Go further with me into the text here. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. The evidence is there, but they're not giving thanks to God. They're not honoring Him as God because they're futile in their thinking and they're foolish in their hearts. Claiming to be wise, they became foolish.
You think about those people that came up out of Egypt and all those things they saw that God done to the Egyptians, and then ultimately parting the Red Sea, and yet most of them fell in the wilderness, what Joshua and Caleb, you know what I mean? And it's just like, why? Because they suppressed the truth. And to me, it's just amazing that those people that would have witnessed that firsthand would have. Okay, so what was it? Was it an intellect problem? Did they not see those things? No. Their heart was wrong. That's what it is. That just amazed me. I would have thought at least the people that saw that firsthand would have this fear of God and recognition of how He controlled those things, beyond what is natural in a, in a miraculous way. And it was for their benefit. And yes, one day 23,000 fell in the wilderness.
Yes, and at that point, coming along with this, there they see the miracles of God. We see the work of God and everything around us. You take the beauty of everything around us as you see the trees begin to grow the leaves, and the flowers begin to bloom, and the sun rises and the sun sets, and how beautiful it is, and all these things. You can't help but realize that somebody had to make it right. It wasn't just the perfect storm, if you will, to where things just so happened to fall that way. God made it. And so here they are, without excuse for not turning to God, because the evidence of it is all around. That's why today, if we talk to somebody and they don't believe in God, we can go show them the Bible, but they're not going to agree with us on the Bible until they understand that this came from God. And that's why, what's the evidence we often point to when we want to show them that God exists? Look at how all these things work. And how it can't happen by just chance. There had to be an intelligent creator who made all these things just as it is.
I believe it's Romans chapter 11 that God gave those people a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, ears that could not hear. What's that mean? Well, I believe it was because the foolish heart was darkened or whatever like that. So God's like, hey, I'm not going to force my word into your heart. It's like, if you're going to persist in going down this road, then I'm going to give you over to this debased or reprobate mind. And God's not a respecter of the person, so what's the practical lesson today? If I suppress the truth about certain parts or the whole thing of God's word, I don't want that. If I persist in that long enough, God's not a respecter of the person. What's He going to do? He's going to give me a spirit of stupor. And I believe that's where I go beyond the point where I can accept and obey what God tells me to do. And that's scary.
And I think that's pointed out later on is the problem with the Gentiles here too, that they go over the sorrowful passions, and God gives them up to a debased mind. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But it's because they've so rejected. God's not forcing His will on anyone. And so, if you want to come listen, God is more than willing. But if they're not willing to listen, He's not forcing anyone to obey. Question number 6 now in our workbook. We'll move on to the next section here. How are God's invisible attributes clearly seen?
In the creation.
In the creation. It's by the things that He has made, according to verse 20. Now, God's wrath is revealed in His whole unrighteousness. Why? They've not glorified God. Secondly, he points out in 24 through 32 how it is they haven't done so. So it says that here they are claiming to be wise, they're fools. Here they are, they're the unrighteous, they're the ungodly. And it talks about them not honoring Him. But 24 through 32 is really pointing out, here's how it is that you've not glorified God in the way that you've been living. There's 4 subsections to this, so we'll read through them one at a time. If you want to see these subsections again, they'll be at the top when we're reading through the section. Where the heading is at the top now, this is how they have not glorified God. Each of these 4 sections will be up there as we read through them if you want to remind yourselves where we are. But here's the 4 of them. How they haven't glorified God, they exchanged the truth for the lie. They exchanged the natural for the unnatural. They didn't retain God in their knowledge. And so they filled themselves with things deserving of death. And those are the 4 things he points out. Verse 24 beginning. Therefore God gave them him up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of the bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and have not worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. There's the truth before them, and the opportunity to hear, the opportunity to believe the truth. The evidence that God exists is there, and so they should be seeking out His will, and yet instead they're exchanging that and what God has said for things that are false. And they're turning from serving God, serving the Creator, to serving the creature or the creation. And so here they are, exchanging the truth for a lie, and by turning from the Creator to serve the creature. Question 7. How is it who do they serve instead of God?
The creature, or the creation.
The creation. You think about back into verse 23, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
Hey, Micah, you think about in our society today, I think it's illegal to destroy a bald eagle egg, okay? But man is made in the image of God, and people can kill little babies, but if you destroy an egg from an eagle, then I heard the other day in some places now it's against the law to kill a snake. So we're elevating things of the creation more than we are those that are made in the image of God. I think that's a practical lesson from this.
You're right. In fact, I think along that point later on, one of the passages that I think shows us how far society has come is later on, just real quick, that there are those that are heartless and ruthless. I think some of them say they're unloving, and that is later on in the text. I don't have time to go into any of those in any great detail, but the point of those is they're without natural affection, which is the problem of our society today, to point out, where they're wanting to glorify these animals more than the man created in the image of God. 26 and 27 now. Not only in 25, before 25, had they exchanged the truth for a lie, 26 through 27, they exchanged the natural for the unnatural. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women who were consumed with passions for one another, committing shameless acts with men who are receiving in themselves the penalty of their error. And we're not going to spend a great deal of time on this. One, we know what's under consideration in 26 through 27. That's the sin of homosexuality. We're willing here in the next few weeks, we'll probably explore that. As we've been doing our series of lessons on sin and worldliness. We're going to do that again today, talking about fornication. So we'll probably try to talk about that here in the next month or two in more details. We're not going to spend a great deal of time here, but a couple of things to point out. As they talk about that, that's just how they are, and people can't help themselves. It says here that there is the natural, right? There's the natural thing, and there is the unnatural. And they're exchanging natural relationships for things contrary to nature. Verse 28 now. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. But part of the problem is, here are people who didn't retain God in their knowledge. Here are people who didn't see fit to acknowledge Him. And so God gave them up to a debased mind. Now, I think that's, again, sometimes people ask the question about, like, when you go back to Pharaoh. Right? You study Pharaoh, it says that the Lord hardened his heart. The Lord was not forcing His will on him. The reason Pharaoh's heart was hardened was because
Pharaoh had a heart problem.
Pharaoh had a heart problem, right? Pharaoh was the one who was really hardening his heart. The point that the Lord was hardening his heart is the fact that He was not stopping that from taking place. So God came up to a debased mind. God said, if that's how you want to be, you do what you want to do. That's the problem we're going to have at the end. 29. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree, those who practice these things deserve to die. They not only do them, they give approval to those who practice them. So here they're telling in verse 29, they're filled with all sorts of unrighteousness, right? What's the problem at the beginning? Those that are ungodly and unrighteous face the wrath of God. What's the problem with This is the Gentiles under consideration right now in verse 28. What's the problem? They're filled with unrighteousness. All of these kinds of things. And it's a list we're familiar with. We've seen several lists like these in the Scriptures. But, the evil, covetousness, malice, all of these things they're filled with. A couple we want to hit real quick before we come to a close. Gossips. Remember, there are some things that are viewed as not being some things we view as sort of minor issues, and yet right there alongside all murder and homosexuality is gossips. Also, disobedient to parents. Those that have reached the age of accountability. Right? And those who obeyed the gospel and chose not to obey their parents, those who have reached the age of accountability, one of the things they've done in violation of God's law is not being obedient parents. And you think about the society we live in today where there are those who don't listen to their parents or anybody in any place of authority. And so that's one of the things listed there alongside murders as well. Verse 32, not only these, but those that give approval to those who practice them. So a couple things to hit real quick. Their time's up. How can we give approval to sin? A few things. We can treat people like sin hasn't been committed. That's one problem. Say another. We can do it through social media. That's a way in which people they give approval to sin. They may not realize it. Comments and likes by ignoring the sin. And then some practical lessons. There's need for obedience, need for pray, need to preach to those who are without excuse, who do not glorify God.
Paul's letter to the church of Corinth didn't only condemn the man that had his father's wife in an illicit relationship. He also said you're puffed up over it. So I believe that's a practical place where people are lending their approval to by being puffed up.
Yes, absolutely. We'll pick up in chapter 2, Lord willing, on Wednesday.